Good afternoon from Paris. Good morning or evening, where you might be located. It's a real pleasure to be hosting the launch of the 2021 Regulatory Policy Outlook. I just want to note that this meeting will be recorded, largely for the sake of posterity, so that we can post this on our website going forward. But please be conscious of the fact that the meeting's being recorded. For those of you who don't know, the Regulatory Policy Outlook is the flagship publication of the Regulatory Policy Committee. It comes out every 3 years. It's a very comprehensive document that basically assesses the regulatory management practices of OECD members and the European Commission. And it also provides a number of thematic chapters which look at various topics which are relevant to regulatory policy within the OECD and globally. So we're really excited to launch it today. And without further ado, I'm very happy to have an opening presentation from Secretary General Matthias Cormann, who very kindly signed the foreword to the Outlook. So we're really happy that he can kind of kick this meeting off. So without further ado, if we could have that presentation going.
Chers collègues, je suis ravi de lancer l'édition 2021 de Politique de la réglementation, perspective de l'OCDE. This launch takes place against the backdrop of a once-in-a-century global health and economic crisis. Recent events have been a stark reminder that the management of the global commons presents very real challenges. And there is a paradox. At a time when trusted, evidence-based, internationally coordinated and well-enforced regulations are more important than ever, a deterioration of trust in governments, experts and evidence makes it more difficult to reach consensus in rulemaking. The current situation, though, presents a unique window of opportunity to transform the way governments make rules. So as we approach the 10th anniversary of the 2012 OECD recommendation on regulatory policy and governance, I would like to invite you to look back on member countries' achievements and to consider the ongoing and emerging challenges and opportunities for regulatory policy reform going forward. Previous versions of this outlook highlighted that regulating well can be challenging even in the so-called normal times. Regulators need to grapple with many technical complexities and uncertainties. There are often political pressures and constraints in decision-making and policy delivery. But unless all this is done well, regulatory initiatives can be inadequate or even counterproductive. They may have unintended consequences or achieve their goals at excessive cost with excessive burdens. In some cases, they may not serve their goals at all, or worse, have a negative impact. All these concerns need to be at the forefront of policymakers' minds as they upgrade regulatory frameworks to address today's challenges. In regulating, we need to be very clear on what issue needs to be addressed and that a particular regulatory approach actually helps make things better, not just more burdensome, complex and more expensive. Sound regulatory policy has never been more important. The post-pandemic rebuilding of economies and societies requires changes and improvements to regulations that underpin our market economy, better balancing economic efficiency with sustainability goals, equality of opportunity and resilience. Governments also need to become better at cooperating on regulatory matters with cross-border implications. The ability to provide clear, rational, and well-reasoned evidence-based public policy will help to rebuild, refocus, and reform economies for decades to come, as well as to promote trust. This third edition of the Regulatory Policy Outlook reflects on these challenges and calls for a regulatory reboot for the 21st century. Governments will need to refocus and pay attention to cross-border flows, environmental issues, inequality, innovation, and foresight in public policies. The approval of the OECD recommendation for agile regulatory governance to harness innovation at last week's OECD Ministerial Council meeting is a key step to help countries on this front. but strengthening the core building blocks of better regulation will continue to be as important as ever. And there is work to be done in this regard. Less than 1/4 of OECD members systematically assess whether rules have worked as intended. Countries need to redouble their efforts using the traditional regulatory policy tools of impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and ex-post evaluation. For more than 60 years, the unwavering focus of the OECD has been to preserve individual liberty and to increase economic and social well-being. In short, to promote better policies for better lives. Better policies begin with better policy making. I trust that this new edition of the Regulatory Policy Outlook will show governments the path to start improving rulemaking for a more balanced, sustainable, and cohesive global society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. It was we were very pleased that he both signed the preface to the Outlook and gave us that presentation. I'd also like to note that, as he mentioned, last week was the OECD ministerial meeting, and the Outlook was one of the key deliverables to that meeting. I'd like now to present some of the key findings to the Outlook, but I'd also like to let you know that we do have a question and answer function open, so please submit your questions, and either I or my whole regulatory policy division team would be happy to try to answer questions going forward. So as we heard from the Secretary General, the Outlook does present a somewhat sober state of affairs regarding the design and delivery of regulation across the OECD. But I think it's important to also note, and I'll discuss some of those challenges just shortly, but I think it's important to note that the Outlook really also lays a kind of a way forward, a very ambitious plan for how OECD countries can really up their regulatory game, and I'll get into that as well. It's clear that COVID was sort of an underlying current, a preoccupying factor as we were developing this Outlook. I mean, it was really raging, literally as we were writing it. But I think it's important that when we look at COVID, we don't look at COVID in the narrow, we look at it in the broad. And in particular, the fact that COVID has really highlighted or magnified a number of pre-existing challenges that we've known for a long time. Most notably, I think we need to recognize that we live in a world of interconnected opportunities and risks. Now, the opportunities of globalization are well known. They've been documented in previous outlooks and in many other publications of the OECD. But I think the risks that COVID highlight about the interconnectedness of life is really kind of at the fore now. And I think it's worth recognizing that basically every citizen on the planet is subject to this potential deadly virus. So it really reminds us of how pervasive these risks are. And I think they rear their head in many quarters, obviously around climate change, which is really presenting very existential threats to all of us. I think it's important that we reflect on the systematic inequalities that we see. While many regulations are really meant to protect the most vulnerable in society, we see these inequalities growing over time in many countries, and that gives pause. So you can see where I'm going here. I mean, there are many regulatory challenges out there. And so governments really need to rethink how they regulate. And in that regard, the regulatory policy outlook is sort of calling for a regulatory policy 2.0 agenda, which really offers an opportunity to adapt, to amend, and to create more agile regulatory frameworks for regulation. Let me first kind of get to what some of the shortcomings that I think we see that the outlook identifies in terms of the rulemaking process for countries. First, and perhaps most worrying, is the fact that many regulatory management practices remain underdeveloped or underutilized. This is particularly worrying for me, and that this is the third outlook. We initially developed a set of indicators, which my colleague Christian Arndt will discuss in a second, that looked at regulatory management practices across OECD countries, and they were very diverse and heterogeneous. And over the course of the last 9 years, we haven't seen more consolidation. We haven't seen more improvement in those practices, and that's quite worrying. I think we can point to some improvement in stakeholder engagement, and Christian will talk to that in a second. But when you look at impact assessment, which is quite common in most OECD countries, we see that it's not really systematically done across agencies, and oftentimes it's carried out very late in the process and doesn't really inform sort of policy development in the way that it should. More worryingly still is ex post evaluation and review, how laws are evaluated. And this is woefully underutilized across the OECD. And it appears almost to be a forgotten kind of tool of regulatory policy, again, which is extremely concerning. There's also evidence that many jurisdictions do not have a whole of government approach to how they regulate. You find certain ministries or agencies that are very adept and do regulatory management very well, but then there are others that do not, and that kind of gives rise to potential risk trade-offs when the government's not fully aligned in its lawmaking and rulemaking processes. We also find evidence that there's not systematic adoption of international regulatory cooperation within governments. And again, some of those challenges that we identified earlier, these very global challenges, really need kind of cooperation across jurisdictions. So there's quite a bit more to be done there. Kind of as evidence of all of this, the outlook points to the really significant differences, the resources and political capital that countries put into their fiscal and monetary policy versus their regulatory policy. And that's very striking. When you think about fiscal policy, it's hugely scrutinized by governments. Monetary policy, has vast resources that go to central banks to really look at what these impacts are going to be. But you can't say the same about regulation. And that kind of gives me pause. I mean, after all, regulation affords, human rights to all of us. It protects the environment. It makes markets function better. And clearly these have very significant costs and benefits to society, but they're probably not as carefully studied as they could be. So I really hope that the outlook kind of gives regulatory policy greater recognition in the way that fiscal and monetary policy have. It's also, I think, important to note that many of the challenges that regulatory policy face are also being driven or exacerbated by technological change. Obviously, technological progress has been remarkable over the last 20 years, and it affords society phenomenal opportunities, but there are also very significant risks at hand. And the outlook really argues that governments need to be much more nimble in their lawmaking efforts. They can't have this kind of traditional regulate and forget mindset, and they need to develop much more adaptive approaches in learning. So looking ahead, what kinds of ideas do we put forward in terms of what kind of improvements can be made? We think that RIA, regulatory impact assessment, needs to be reimagined a little bit. And in particular, it needs to consider the broad toolkit of regulatory approaches that are available, be they traditional regulation or regulatory sandboxes, performance-based software approaches, and it really steers kind of policy into getting the right tool to address the problem at hand. I think we also need to move away kind of from sort of simple cost benefit analysis and really focus much more on the human side of the impacts of regulation, how they might distribute across society and the community. In terms of stakeholder engagement, we believe that regulators and policymakers need to work much more upstream with vast parts of society to really understand what kinds of regulations are needed to address societal risks. And also ex post evaluation really needs to become at the fore of regulatory policy. And we believe that COVID is a great opportunity in terms of many new regulations were introduced kind of under sort of emergency measures. And it really affords an opportunity to do much more careful review and also to look at all the legacy regulation that's on the books to see whether that might be tamed back a bit. Second, the outlook really points to the importance of regulatory oversight. Having a body that's really responsible for the implementation of high quality regulation across the whole government is really a vitally important factor for performance. And these oversight bodies perform really important features in terms of their gatekeepers for regulatory quality. They're oftentimes advocating for reform. They coordinate across the government. And also, ultimately, they will be the developers of kind of regulatory policy 2.0 in all of your jurisdictions. So it's really important to think about how their role can be strengthened within countries. Third, the outlook really suggests applying the lessons from behavioral insights in a much more meaningful and deep way throughout the policy cycle. To date, usually behavioral insights has been applied kind of to influence individual choice, to ensure that we eat healthier foods or that we're aware of what the gas requirements of our car are. But I think the outlook really advocates for thinking about how BI can be embedded much more systemically into the policymaking process itself. Behavioral insights really derives from this notion that we as individuals have many psychological biases, and oftentimes we might not make rational choices. But when you think about it, policymakers also have those same biases. And in fact, there's good example of governments which tend to institutionalize rather than overcome these behavioral anomalies in the policymaking process. So a good example of this is risk aversion. Oftentimes, government policies are far too precautionary when the risks at hand perhaps might not be quite as severe. So the outlook gives lots of examples in terms of how you can kind of embed BI more in kind of systemically in the policymaking process. Fourth, and importantly, the outlook looks to improvements in regulatory, the delivery side of regulation. Through how can governments be smarter about how they go about their enforcement inspections? How can they really make certain that the way in which regulations are implemented is really based on and proportionate to risk? And how can they be focused on outcomes? Again, we really feel that the downstream side, the regulatory delivery stage of regulation is largely overlooked by jurisdictions in their better regulation frameworks. And we provide a number of suggestions in terms of how that can be redressed. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think the outlook really calls on rebuilding trust in regulation, in regulators, and ultimately in government activity. And we provide a number of ideas in terms of how to do that. And I think probably one of the core issues is that really, when it comes to regulation, it's so important that policymakers and regulators don't think about the law or a regulation in terms of kind of black letter. It simply needs to be enforced, but really what kinds of outcomes it generates. Because ultimately, I think, Secretary General Corman mentioned, I mean, we're really after, having better regulations for better lives. So let me leave it at that, and I'll pass over to Christian, who will give you some more details about the findings of the outlook. Thank you very much for your attention.
Next slide, please. So in case you were wondering whether you were moved to a meeting of neurologists, I can reassure you that we are still in the meeting on the regulatory policy outlook. So what does this image show? It shows that if people say that their encounter with government was painful, they really tell the truth. If people feel unfairly treated, they feel excluded. And then the same region is activated in the brain as with physical pain. So people are right when they say this is painful. Now, the positive news is that there are many things that governments can do to make people feel fairly treated, and regulatory policy is at the core of it. Give people a voice in the development of rules. Ask them, do they actually function in practice? Those who have to apply them, they often know much better than those who have drafted them. Explain to the public the rules and the reasoning for them and why they have to be a cost. So what are the benefits? How the government took on board any comments that stakeholders made, and of course, reduce any unnecessary admin burdens or sludge, as I think is more the term nowadays. Next slide, please. Now, again, the positive news is that in almost all OECD countries now, public consultation is common. So this is not happening anymore only with refined circles of certain stakeholders, but it's possible for everyone to comment in most OECD countries nowadays on draft laws. Now, commenting on draft laws obviously is very important, and the devil is often in detail, but it's not enough. And they're promising initiatives to do this even earlier, but this only happens on a systematic basis so far in 20% of countries. So why early? So early is important to actually figure out, do we really need a regulation? Do we really need a new law? Or are there other alternatives? Are there better options to address the policy problem? And stakeholders are often very well placed to come up with ideas to get creative. And again, that also makes them feel included in the process, alluding to the first slide I've just shown. Equally important for people to feel fairly treated is explanations. Explanations so far on how comments were taken on board in stakeholder consultation processes only happen so far in less than half of OECD countries. So we know it's possible. There are a lot of ways of doing this, and not necessarily always getting back to everyone, but there can be summaries, but this is essential. Studies show that often the explanations are even more important than the result. If comments have been taken on board and people are not aware of it, they do not know they actually had an impact on government action. And if the comments were not taken on board, but there were good reasons for it, it's very important that these reasons are explained so that stakeholders then still can understand why the final result might look different from what they would like to have. All of this ensures that people feel much more included in the process and also comply more with laws and regulations, because if it's clear to them what the reasoning for them is and there are possibilities to participate, this obviously makes it more attractive to comply with laws and regulations. Next slide, please. Now, stakeholders also need to know about cost and benefits. And so far, this is not the case in all countries that regulatory impact assessments, for instance, are published and this information is published, but this is increasing. So I think this is a very positive and important trend. Regulatory impact assessment shows what are the impacts of a proposed law and regulation. Countries have in particular improved over the last decade a lot the assessment of costs. So this has moved from just some sentences to very detailed and quantification of costs to different groups. Now, what still can be improved is the assessment of benefits as well on the other side, because obviously the costs then need to be balanced with the benefit side. Is it worth it? Are the costs worth it? To give you an example, in climate change, for instance, if we only talk about cost associated with rules, then for citizens, it's very hard to understand why they have to be a cost as well. They also need to know what the benefits are. Equally important there is not just to look into costs and benefits of the regulation that's planned, but to really, really use this tool, not just to justify a decision which is made, but to use it to actually look into the pros and cons of different solutions. Again, here coming back to climate change, what happens if we don't do anything? And a number of countries do estimate that. The do nothing option, what happens? What are the costs of that? That could be higher than the costs of actually passing a law. In other cases, as weird as this might seem, not doing anything might actually be a better option than the law or regulation in place. And obviously, there are a lot of other alternative options, and countries increasingly look into them, but I think there's still a lot of opportunity, as shown in the outlook, for countries to improve on the assessment of alternative options. Next slide, please. Now, all laws and regulations are obviously experiments. They are drafted in a certain time, times change, circumstances change. Maybe even the reason for them is not there anymore. But also, people do not react necessarily the way that might have been anticipated before. So inherently, all laws and regulations are experiments. Very important, and I come back to what Nick said at the beginning of the presentation, this is really an area countries need to focus on. There are a lot of initiatives in that space. It's possible, and with new technologies, there will be more and more possibilities as well. It will be much easier with artificial intelligence, for instance, to scan the initiatives, and that I heard recently in a seminar on Canada, for instance, and scanning all types of different laws and regulations in place to see if there might be different definitions of the same terms, if there might be unnecessary overlaps, etc. So with new technology, there will be a lot of possibilities to look at the stock of regulations. Some estimates already from a time ago from the Australian Productivity Commission put actually the benefits of regulatory reform at an increase of GDP of 1.3%. Linking that again to what Nick said before, fiscal and monetary policy, they have gotten a lot of attention, but they might also have some limitations today. Let's also make sure we really use this tool of regulatory reform to the fullest, especially in the situation we're currently at. Let me close with some words on COVID. We have also information in the outlook on that. We looked into what practices were used in that period. And we can see that there as well, there's a lot of room for improvement. It's not in the crisis situation that it's easy to develop all the tools like risk-based regulation, making sure evidence is collected in a fast way, that there is a continuous engagement of stakeholders as the regulatory response needs to be adapted throughout. And it does not help anyone if regulations don't make any sense or if it's impossible to apply them. So there again, the importance of solid processes. Now, I know the word process always sounds very boring, but it's like with car. If the process of building and assembling them is not working, then later on the cars also will not function. And that's not different from rules and regulation. We invite you to ask any questions you have on the Outlook. Obviously, consult the Outlook, but also ask any questions you might have in the Q&A function. Nick, would you like to answer any questions or add anything before I move over to the panel discussion?
Hi, I just answered one question on proportionality on the screen. So thanks for all the questions. We'll get to them as we can. But no, I think that's it from us. I'm really delighted now to pass over to Stefan Naundorf, who is the chair of the Regulatory Policy Committee and responsible for better regulation in the Federal Chancellor of Germany. So Stefan, over to you for the panel discussion.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Christiane, and thanks to the team, and in particular, a big thank you to all of the delegates and the colleagues and the governments who have contributed to this publication and answering, I understand, 600 questionnaire. So that's really an effort, and it's great that we can present on this strong empirical basis, this report. I have the great pleasure of moderating a panel of very distinguished and for our context, partly rather atypical guests. And if you haven't done so, please don't hesitate to switch on your camera. To the audience, we have agreed, at least by exchanging emails, that we will try to do this in a talk show format with short comments, not long lectures. And we are very happy if you have any questions or comments from your side, from the floor, then we will try to come back to that. So I'm very happy to welcome here two colleagues who, from a regulatory point of view, represent those concerned. Usually we talk about those concerned when we talk about citizens and civil society and the business sector. And it's my pleasure to welcome Hilary Sutcliffe here from Society Inside. Thank you for waving the hand. And Roslyn Doctor from IBM from the business sector. Could you explain us, perhaps just in a few sentences, what your core activity yesterday was for your organization? You're working in very different contexts, but I know from the bios that you have met before. And I was particularly intrigued, Hilary, by the fact that you're named as one of the 100 brilliant women in artificial intelligence ethics. So that's kind of interesting.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. My focus is on trust and governance and technology. And that's not just as AI, but gene editing or quantum tech or neurotechnologies of yesterday. That's what I was doing at the European Brain Summit. We think that societal trust in regulation is as important and should seem to be as important in its own right as trust in the technology. And I was so pleased to see that trust was mentioned 81 times in this excellent report. So congratulations there. And even trustworthiness as well, which sometimes doesn't get connected. So suddenly with COVID, people began to see what I've been on about all this time, because we saw that trust in the governance of the COVID vaccine, of the approval process, was as important to vaccine hesitancy as trust in the vaccine itself. And our Center for Data Ethics in this context said, trust in the rules and regulations governing technology is the single biggest predictor of whether someone believes that digital tech has a role to play in governance, in COVID response. So this is my focus, trust and governance itself.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for giving us a perfect example of being brief. Great. Rosalind, you're working at the business sector for a huge company, IBM. I'm always recalling Odyssey in Space with the supercomputer hall. So is trust an issue for you as well?
Absolutely. It's great to be here. I applaud the report. Hillary, we're in the same job, right? IBM is 100 years old, and despite the movie HAL, which we did not create HAL, we have stewarded responsible technology, right? And that is not just making sure we had privacy by design built in earlier, and now ethics by design being built in the earliest stages, but making sure we have principles and calling for policies also to create that trust. Because where we don't have policy is exactly as Hillary said, and where there's a vacuum, industry has to step in. And we published our own guardrails for how we will deploy or not deploy technology during COVID. And we put those out there. We heard talks about explainability and being transparent. So we've done that as an industry, and my role is to work with governments to make sure that they put these policies in place that civil society wants, that industry wants, and that works for government. And we can, I welcome this conversation because I heard so much from Nick and from the Secretary General that we applaud. And I think this report will get us into a better place.
Thanks a lot. And we will come to the relationship between trust and regulation very quickly. But before, I would like to introduce two distinguished scientists with us here at the panel. I'm very happy to welcome Claudio Radelli and also Antonio Visita. Great to have both of you here. You're kind of observing and analyzing our work in the regulatory community. So should we just listen more carefully to you, and then we will receive better evaluation by the OECD? Perhaps Claudio, I know you're engaged in the project on the procedural tools for effective governance. So, yeah, once again, the entry question is: should we just listen to you?
Actually, it's important to listen to a wide range of voices and then understand where evidence is, where expertise is, and differentiate it from values, opinions, because in the end, good regulation is a kind of equation where we have a sum of robust evidence plus balanced values, and they all have to take into consideration. What I learned from this report is that there is an effort to use the tools across the government, so whole of government, but then better regulation 2.0 needs also whole of cycle, and on evaluation, the indicators of the OECD show there is a delay in making systematic ex-post regulatory evaluation. And then I would add the third element of a whole of person. And that means two things. One is to use behavioral insights and understand how people in the real world behave, but also whole of person means gearing regulation towards impactful, meaningful effects on the life of people, so that they can feel the benefits of this better regulation effort in their own lives.
Antonio, I understand. Thank you, Claudio, first of all. Antonio, I understand you have a focus rather, or also on economic effects. And so, yeah, is it you we should listen to just to make sure that business sector is not just complaining about regulations?
Yes, first of all, let me thank you for the invitation, but also for this very important report. Actually, I have this both sides of my story, because I was a telecommunications regulator since a few months ago, and I've been also involved in some of the work of the OECD. But as an economist, I have precisely this field on researching on how regulation impact on business models, especially in the digital environment. And one point I think it's important to focus to, that is really stressed in the report, is try to understand how, and this is also a matter of trust, according to what Hilary said, how do we cope with uncertainty in cases in which even the standard ways in which we approach to uncertainty are not very clear, and the COVID was just an example of that. It was a strong uncertainty, not only on the matter, but also on the impact on the behavior of people and on the relationship between single behavior, collective behavior, and cooperation among states in different sectors. And so what I think is that when we design regulation in terms of options, and we analyze several options, we have also to clarify what is the nature of uncertainty and what is the timing we assume to be followed in terms of the minimum time required to make evaluation about uncertainty, because it may differ across sectors. And in some cases, the information we need are revealed in different times. So one point is how do we deal with uncertainty, and what is the horizon time we need in order to learn about that. COVID has somehow outlined in several sectors that we may learn different things in different times. So what we need is adaptation and flexibility, together with the ability of learning and involving all the stakeholders in. This is not easy at all, but maybe what we need is much more transparency to get really people involved and to outline all the options that we have, including options on how to deal with uncertainty. And conclusively, this made it a little bit to stress the importance of agile regulation in the meaning of having much more adaptation and much more ex-post evaluation, rather than just on strict ex-ante rules. Because in some cases, when we need to learn, maybe what we need is just to have tentative rules, but much more ex-post adaptation rather than strict rules without ex-post evaluation and adaptation. So I think that economics may just help in suggesting to regulators on how to deal with uncertainty in a transparent way.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Just to close the circle and to welcome our fifth panelist, Florentin. Great to have you here. Perhaps you are the one with the longest experience in regulation here at this table. You have been working with the World Bank Group. You have seen many countries in the world and their regulatory systems. And I understand you're focusing on risk and risk management. This is one of the issues of your interest. So I wonder, isn't transparency also including an element of risk? So when I look at the delegates here at the committee, isn't it a bit risky to fill in the questionnaire and to find yourself then at an unexpected ranking in one of our graphs? And I've seen Rosalind reacting already 2 times, so we will open the discussion quickly. But Florentin, first your presentation or your entry words. We can't hear you in the moment, or at least I can't hear you. Okay, perhaps you try to fix your mic, and we give Rosalind the
okay,
chance
now maybe
now we can hear you. Perfect. Florentin, please.
I don't know what's happening, sorry. So yes, transparency certainly has an element of risk. I mean, as ever, when you're exposing yourself, you could find things which which are not the ones you were hoping for. I think on the other hand, it really is a major contributor to trust. I think if we go back to what Christian was saying earlier, if you engage honestly with people, and it's possible to see that the regulatory authorities, the governing bodies are trying to be honest about what they do and how they do it, I think you're building some of the preconditions of public trust. And you're also building the conditions to improve yourself, right? If you don't do it in a way, you're never going to get anywhere further. So it's certainly a risk, but it's a risk that's hopefully beneficial.
Thank you. And Rosalind, you have already reacted. Please.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the previous panelist who was talking about the complexities, and that's the pacing problem. Technology advances exponentially, but laws advance linearly, right? You have the comments, and that's why, and if your report gets at that, we need agile governance, right? It's that anticipatory, that experimental, it's thinking interoperably to be global. These pandemics, climate change, semiconductor shortages, the global problems don't stop at borders. They don't need a vaccination passport or proof to cross borders. And our laws are too much fragmented because of uncertainty, because of the pacing problem with technology. But I think that there are narrow approaches. It was the comment in there on proportionality. If you take a precision regulatory approach, and if you do use case risk-based, you can be agile, right? You want to make sure that the laws can change as they experiment, but you don't need to be afraid. And some things we all agree on, transparency, explainability, they can be required now if we're talking about AI, because without that transparency, people don't know who to share complaints with, right? We think that AI should be disclosed, and there should be a feedback mechanism so that if there is a problem, somebody can share and inform, and then researchers can look at those and maybe improve the AI. So we're very supportive of this, and we acknowledge there's that pacing problem, but think through experimentation and agile governance, it can be addressed.
And if I understand you correctly, transparency has something to do with understanding. Transparency is not an end in itself. Is this correct?
So I think there's 2 ways to look at transparency. One, there's the showing that, hey, AI is being used. You should know when you're interacting with the chatbot, right? You should know that if you're walking in front of a screen that they're going to do facial recognition, as you walk into that store, right? So then you can walk around, or you can do that. So that is one level of transparency. The other level of transparency is tied to explainability so that a user can understand. I think Nick explained it, that you want to know if, or Christian, you want to know if your comments were used in the law or not and why. You also want to know big picture how an AI solution came to that decision, right? And so you need some level of, look, this is the data that was used for this. This is how it was trained. This is its oversight, and this is how and why it came to that decision. And we think that that makes sense for high risk solutions, that be obligated on the user of the AI solution.
Thank you. So what's about understanding without transparency? Hilary, you have agreed to Rosalind's contribution. Look, I think I'm a trustworthy guy, and I explained to you what's in this machine here, so everything's fine. Why isn't this enough from your point of view?
Well, I think this is the role of governance and regulation, because there is trust. There's actually probably more trust in technology companies than have been deserved in terms of, not obviously IBM, but in terms of AI. And I think I do welcome the new EU regulations, which is asking, what are we worried about and what are we not worried about? And focusing right down on addressing those things that we're worried about. Because this is fundamental to citizens' trust in governance, that they know that it's there to start with, and that they can see that it's working, and that it's not only working in terms of good outcomes, but also that it's being enforced. And this is the trouble with AI governance at the moment. Those knowing that it's there, considering it's across all sorts of different regulatory in any country and internationally, and how is it going to be enforced and how are we going to tell?
Mm-hmm. So are there positive examples of how to tell and how to explain and how to give transparency?
So I'd like to know your thought on that, Rosamund. I don't see any at the moment. There's a lot of discussion and talk and a lot of discussion and talk. But if I'm just a concerned citizen, my mother, my brother, I don't know what to say to them, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think I'm pretty where you are, Hilary, right? That we're getting there. IBM has fact sheets that we use, and remember, we're an enterprise company, right? 98% of the world's banks touch IBM. Telecom touches us. So our fact sheets are geared for our users of the technology, but other companies are doing similar data sheets. These could be thought of as like nutrition labels. Right? Before, we didn't know what went into our food. We don't need to know everything about the food. There's some secret sauce, right? That's why you buy that. But you need to know how much sugar is in there, how much fat, right? You need to know if there's nuts in there, if you're allergic. So, but there needs to be global coordination. And we're seeing this at the IEEE and ISO to develop the standards so that this is acceptable level of explainability. And then we can all meet that standard and make sure that that works for the various stakeholders, right? It has to be use case and user specific. So I'm encouraged. And one other example is that in the United States, way on our side of the pond, the NIST, right, our National Institute for Standards and Technology, is convening stakeholders to talk about a AI risk management framework. And if it's like the cybersecurity one or the privacy one, it'll be use case specific, and it will be a living document, right? So that as time goes on, you can address that what's going on in the real world and adjust the framework accordingly.
Thank you. I think so we started with AI. That's something like the simple application from my point of view. But I think our issue, our products here are regulations and laws. So I wonder, Antonio, would this be convincing to say, okay, look, we do something like an OECD quality label. This regulation of the telecom authority has been developed according to the rules of OECD, so everything's fine. Would this be Would this help us?
No, this is certainly true because indeed, even if we have, of course, some local specificities, the more we are able to set standards in terms of, the way in which similar market with similar services could be regulated in different parts of the world, may help on the one side on accepting the standards and try to reduce litigations at the local level, but on the other also in setting somehow, especially for those services that have global markets and for which relevant markets go well beyond the national boundaries, will help in also developing somehow a unique environment for competition in which the same rules are applied. Indeed, as for instance, if I may raise an example, this is precisely what somehow has increased the level of acceptance of regulation within Europe in several sectors in which regulation was actually driven by the European standards in terms of directive and regulation. Because even if national states are always able to make some golden plating around the European laws, on the other side, the fact that it is developing an European standard has helped in introducing and also in advancing the speed of introduction of several regulations that otherwise will not be enough accepted by some national or local stakeholders. So I think that developing general framework and let's say general standards, regulatory standards, will certainly help. The different point is how we can somehow arrange the same thing when we have to analyze ex post evaluation of regulation that is the same in different countries, but that generated different outcomes in different countries. Because that means that probably we have some local reasons that we need to investigate to understand why we have different outcomes in different places in which we are applying actually the same standard. And the point is that we need also standard for having the same level of ex post evaluation, which means revealing information and take stock of what we learned. So I pretty much agree with the idea that we should somehow encourage a sort of standard for regulation in different sectors, also because this will help us to increase competitiveness.
So I understand standards, yes, not necessarily a label always according to OECD rules, rather a label according to EU rules. Is this, Claudio, how do you see that?
It's a fascinating point. What we're doing in this report is a kind of set of measurements, indicators that tell us, in a sense, what is the benchmark we saw before, all the graphs with the countries at the bottom or at the top of the distribution. And what does it mean? It means that they have some rules about how regulations should be made, how should stakeholders engaged, what kind of tests should be done. And in our project Protego, we do more or less the same, but with different approach. We measure the quality of design, and this is powerful because it applies to whole of government, no matter what the rule is. But then there is the rule itself. So the OECD quality standards are rules about how the rules should be made. It's a kind of meta regulation. Then we have the rules, and design again is very important. But even with the best impact assessment or stakeholder consultation, we may end up with a rule that has unforeseen consequences, not obviously, especially in dynamic sectors and with disruptive innovations. And then comes the third element of the chain of causality, which is what is the agility of the regulatory system? What is the flexibility that is inbuilt in the system to cope with what happens when regulations hit the road of delivery? And finally is the stuff that Florentin knows very well, is it's not just by publishing a rule somewhere or a standard somewhere that things happen. Is when inspectors intervene, when courts intervene, when compliance is measured and non-compliance is treated one way or the other. So this is a kind of a long cycle, and correctly, Nikki before was reminding us of the importance of then going back and having oversight bodies. But we have to be aware of this total kind of cycle in which what we're reading today in the Outlook is mostly on the stage of having design. But it is important, it's as important as saying that a constitution that is badly written is a bad constitution, because then the parliamentary activity will not produce the expected results.
Let's stay for a moment with the issue of agility and speed and flexibility, as I've heard before. Florentin, from your experience on the ground, do you think people and companies rather wish to have something like a warm, cozy rain of regulations constantly adopted and further developed, or what is the ideal behind this concept of agility and flexibility? Or is it rather the concept saying, okay, I have a framework, perhaps I'm not perfectly happy with the framework, but it's the same framework now for 10 years or so?
Oh, it's a complicated question. I think first it depends on the company. What we find is often small businesses tend to like having something simpler and more certain and more defined and having more stability. Larger businesses which are innovating and are at the edge of the technology and have more capacity, may be more interested in things that are a little bit more adaptive and flexible. The second element is it's very related to the trust you have in your regulator. If you have a situation of trust with the regulator, where you know you can engage with them, you know they will give you guidance, you know they're not here to hit you, you know they're here to support you and only resort to rigid enforcement if you really step out of line, then you can have the confidence that agility is in your support. If you're in a hostile relationship, I mean, if a regulatory relationship is seen as a fight or a warfare, then you much prefer to have something very, very clear and to know where you're going. So in a nutshell, you need to have, I think, agility but guidance, especially for small businesses. And agility can only function if you have a framework of trust between regulators and regulators.
Rosalind, is this your experience as well? I have the impression you're a fan of agility.
Well, we've seen what the agile method has done to transform software development, right? That's where that agile governance has come from. It's to experiment, fail fast, and change. And you can't adapt all of that into the design of good regulation. But the idea of being anticipatory, the idea of being experimental, I think you can do both. That you can have some rigidity, right? Some long-term, and then allow exceptions, licensings for exceptions to pilot new innovations and to see if they do preserve trust, to see if they are privacy protecting, right? And then you can reconsider if we should change where we have some rigidity. And one other thought on agile. We've seen in New Zealand, the World Economic Forum Agile Governance Group pointed this out, that they actually designed law to be written in code. And they brought software developers, policymakers, design thinkers together. And by writing law or trying to write law as code, they ended up writing law that was more clear, more transparent and explainable, even to those that didn't want to adopt it by code. And I think that AI is one aspect of agility, but as law can be written by code, where it can be written, not only will compliance costs go down, but that trust between the regulator and the regulated should go up.
Thank you. I would love to come back to this issue of law as code and code as law. But first, let's stay for a moment with agility and trust. Hilary, isn't that a little bit risky to say, okay, look, the regulator, the lawmaker is doing experiments and the law might fail. What does this do to civil society? Isn't this a concept which is kind of difficult to accept, because what is written in the law book, this needs to be kind of a solid fundament for us to work with?
Well, there's two things on that. Just for clarity, I was on the World Economic Forum Agile Governance Council and part of the group that developed the toolkit for regulators, which I can put in, but not the New Zealand project. There's two things to that for me. The greatest concern of citizens, civil society groups, and many academics focuses on the ethical, moral aspects of tech and regulation. So not, is it safe and does it work, but should it be allowed at all? Do we even want this? So they understand that this is a question that just doesn't happen sitting in the back room with a few folks in the OECD or in the government. This has to be done with and collaboratively with all stakeholders. And secondly, I think it's interesting, there was a really good article in Nature on this in relation to COVID. Citizens are not stupid. They're not quite as narrow-minded and sort of, if it doesn't look like this, it's not real regulation. They really are, time and time again, in dialogues and consultations, very pragmatic, very thoughtful. And so I think, no, I don't think citizens will have a problem with that, particularly if it's explained properly, as Christiana said. And I would say this to regulators particularly, get yourself a decent website to explain these things too. I mean, if you look at regulators' website, they are a shocker across the board, certainly in the UK. So how you explain, what format you explain, the language that you explain without being patronizing but being respectful. You can't expect us just to know about this. It's got to be out there for us to be engaged with and us to hear about.
I like very much this notion, citizens are not stupid or narrow-minded. Yes, I can agree. And I've seen in your bio that you're also specialized in collaborative research. So in my context, the regulatory context, we often ask colleagues at ministries, at agencies around the globe to collaborate. My gut feeling is that often enough it is quite a challenge to leave the office and collaborate. So what's your experience with collaborative research? Does collaboration work in research perhaps better than in policy making?
I think it's difficult everywhere. So we had three new skills that were going to be required for regulators in our report. And one of those was building trusted environments for collaborative governance. Because the regulator really is the environment within which collaboration happens. So yes, they do need to get out. There does need to be skills that need to be brought to play. But big collaborations is really hard everywhere, and there are methodologies and there's a mindset for that that is actually quite important, and we'll make some pointers in the report. But I think also this difficulty for you as regulators is, how do we do collaboration without being seen to be captured by vested interests or to have NGOs drive the conversation? And it is difficult, but it is possible. And there's a report from PA Consulting saying that regulators should move from being watchdogs of industry to champions of the public. Now, actually, if you're a champion of the public, this gives you a different sort of mandate and allows for collaboration. It sort of opens the door for collaboration in a way that sort of other framings of regulation doesn't. But it is hard, not to say it's easy.
I like this notion very much, and actually it's on my note already, so we have a little bit spoiled the end, but that's perfectly fine. I promised you to come back to the issue of law and code, and I think we have like 15 more minutes, perhaps 17 more minutes before we will hand over. And actually, I haven't seen many questions right now coming in via the FAQ function. But let's stay for a moment with this rather technical, and I think it's definitely not only technical, this issue, the relationship between law and code. And I would like to share an experience. An institute, part of the Fraunhofer Institutes here in Germany, have done a preliminary work on which type of legislation is good for digitization. And what they came up with was fantastic from our point of view, because they said exactly what we told our colleagues before, that law needs to be clear and comprehensible, in the best case, simple and consistent, and then it's easy to digitize. But so law is code, code is law. Is this the simple solution, Roslyn, or should we perhaps even hand over legislation to computers because they are more structured?
No.
Not every question I'm asking here is meant to be my personal statement.
Now you're reminding me of Hal, right? I want to hear from Florentine because he had a thought on this too. But again, IBM advocates a precision regulatory approach. There's some areas that are ripe for law as code and some not as ripe. I think the financial services sector is one that's more ripe just because of the digitization and the advancement of technology that the banking community is in. I can give you more examples in the financial services, but I do want to hear from Florentine because I'm curious to know his thoughts.
Thanks, Roslyn, and thanks, Stefan. I think that the problem of low as code is as with every tool, right? To what does it apply, and how much does it, which problems does it solve? We have very conclusive research and evidence for many years that you can't design optimal regulations, right? You will always have, when you write a rule, it's always going to be either too broad for your objective or too narrow. And in one case, if it's too broad, you will forbid too many things. If it's too narrow, you will make gaming and creative compliance too easy. And you had a good report from the Scientific Council of the Dutch government 8 years ago, just after the financial crisis, saying precisely we should have much more flexible rules and far greater flexible powers for regulators if we want to prevent financial crisis, because financial institutions are always going to be smarter at gaming the system than the people who write rules. So I do think a low as code can make things easier and clearer in a certain number of cases, but it's got a, in my view, it's got a really limited scope of application, or more precisely, capacity to solve problems. At the end of the day, you always have interpretative issues with rules, right? So you may make some transactions faster, by transforming your rules into code, particularly in the financial sector, also in tax regulation. But at the end of the day, if you want effective rules, right, that will actually prevent the harm that you want to prevent, manage the risks, and at the same time, agile rules that will allow innovation, will not be exceedingly rigid, will not prevent new things from being tested. You will need this flexibility, and that means you need to delegate some authority to the enforcement level, to the actual regulatory frontline level. And that's where really the way regulators are empowered to do that, the way regulators work, and the way therefore regulators can create trust in the communities they regulate is really important. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you, Florentin. I think that was a very relevant quote at the very end: empowering regulators and people in regulation. Claudio, when when students leave your courses, are they fit for the reality to work in the government? Do they know how we can solve these problems, how they agilely produce effective regulation?
You know, Stefan, this is a great question, and I want to answer with total honesty that one thing I really press with the students is regulatory humility, right? And I say everything we know about the heuristics affecting the behavior of ordinary people also applies to regulators. So the sense that the government can be smart, agile, etc. It does not mean that the government knows it all. Otherwise, we could throw away all the tools of better regulation, which are exactly contingent on the assumption of limited information, limited attention, and therefore you need to open up to those who are going to be affected and to other sources of evidence. This is the first thing, to imagine that students can go with a sense of humility as maybe they're not champions of the public, but trustees of something important, which are the global public goods that are so important, from data to climate. You know, we have a big discussion in class on global public good, and also we are educating people at the School of Transnational Governance that one day will be in the advocacy groups, will be in NGOs, will be campaigning for human rights in artificial intelligence. And we want them to be, in a sense, inside the tent of evidence-informed policy, so that they can have a reasoned argumentation, debate, confrontation on the basis of evidence and balanced values. So I think our job is also to educate those who are not joining government, but are going to join civil society organizations or industry, to have a common language. And what the OECD has done for many years has also been to promote really a discourse which is based on key concepts and a common language.
I would like to, I would like to come back to the technical side, because there is a comment at the FAQ regarding fuzziness. So I understand that's even driving the concept of law as code more to the extreme. Perhaps one of you can prepare to answer or to reflect on this. But Nick Malishev has raised his hand. Nick, please.
Oops. Thanks, Stefan. I can't seem to turn my camera on. I wanted to come back to a point that Hillary made. And it's kind of, the idea is that oftentimes regulation occurs quite late in the whole innovation process. And we need some kind of governance guardrails to really shape how technology comes to market. Oftentimes technology is seen as being very deterministic. It's going to happen anyway. And how can, what are the governance guardrails in place specifically? And one thing that I'm struck by, and maybe this is a complete overgeneralization, is that when you look at innovation in the life sciences, oftentimes these reach market fairly, over a very long and deliberate period of time. Whereas oftentimes in the digital sciences, I'm still kind of struck by Mark Zuckerberg's, famous saying about move fast and break things. So, are there different governance frameworks and different innovative, ecospheres which somehow either limit or shape how these technologies come to market?
Thank you, Nick. Now we have two open ends. Perhaps one of you prefers to reflect on Nick directly, and then we come back briefly, at least, to the issue of fuzziness. So, do we need guardrails? Is this does this work? And what's about these business sector guys who just say, okay, let's break the rules. Let's make a new world here where the old rules do not apply. I'm a little bit overdoing it. Rosalind.
Since you're talking about business and you're making this very interesting, so thank you, Stefan. IBM's a 100-year-old company, right? We have evolved over time. We're not as old as European companies, right? I know, like, for you guys, we're young, but for American companies, that's old. And you can't throw out history and tradition and the rules and how lawmaking happens. And that's why the agile governance, I said this before, has that idea of experimentation. So you can do things in parallel. We learn to do a lot in parallel with AI, right? You have the training data, you have the data that you're going to use later to test your testing data, right? You can do traditional rulemaking and give you licenses, have experimentation at the same time. But yes, we believe in guardrails. I said that earlier, that IBM has imposed our own guardrails that we have published, right? And that to Hillary's comment earlier, not all technology should be developed. IBM has said that we're no longer going to develop general purpose facial recognition technologies, right? So I don't think business writ large is saying, let's blow everything up. I do think we encourage the agile governance approach so that regulatory policy making could be more anticipatory, could be more experimental, could be interoperable globally, could be outcomes based, right? That's the proportionality, the risk, sometimes sector use case approach. And it should definitely be user centric, right? We're aware that unless everyone can benefit from these new technologies, right? Unless it's inclusive and it's not exasperating old inequalities, that we all won't benefit. So I take a little pushback from, that blanket of industry. On fuzziness, I didn't see the question, right? So I'm looking for, where do we get fuzziness?
I just read it here. On law and code, what role could smart contracts play in this? Could there also be a loss in losing the fuzziness of natural language law?
Okay, and so smart contracts can play a huge role in some aspects, right? We see on global trade and global supply chain right now, we all know there's such inefficiencies in the system because of lack of transparency and because it's so paper-based, and in addition to a lot of other reasons why we have supply chain issues. And seeing that if you can automate contracts and have those be recognized by the regulator for trade, you can get great efficiencies. And there we haven't seen fuzziness, right? And I think that's why, just like when you set up governance, you need stakeholders involved. If you bring in the regulator, those that wanting to produce innovation, right? Those that are being regulated, but have, like, we want to protect society and be innovative, and society, civil society, and those benefiting or using the tools that we want to put out there, that you could hopefully avoid that fuzziness, as we learned in New Zealand.
Thank you. Hillary, you have raised your hand, and I have another question to add on the list, which is most interesting from my point of view. This is how to match algorithmic regulation with human-centered and bottom-up regulation. Perhaps this is the quality of question for scientists. Yeah, exactly. Antonio is raising himself. So first, Hillary, please.
So thank you, Nick. I'd just like to respond to Nick's question there about governance guardrails, which I think is an excellent phrase and an excellent concept. There's two things for me with that. Just because it's a long term, so life sciences, it doesn't mean that any more anticipatory governance actually happens. It does seem to sort of happen almost, at the last minute, even though you have 20 years to think about it. I was at the European Brain Summit yesterday, talking about patient centricity, and it was quite astonishing how the lack of patient-centered research and development, even though you're talking about neuro diseases or regenerative robotics and those types of things, quite astonishing. So I think there are some guardrails that can be applied across different technologies. And I think one of those is very much about foresight, which is in your report quite a lot, and early warnings of problems. Every single disaster that we've seen, there's been somebody somewhere warning us for ages. Usually somebody which is outside the mainstream, an academic or a civil society organization or citizens themselves. And I think for me, the biggest and most valuable finding of our entire trust project is the importance of taking seriously those people you don't really take seriously, because they are usually the ones that have those warnings that you need to take care of. And that sort of engagement might be part of the governance guardrails sort of process if you were to do such a thing.
I'm provoked to add one of my most beloved examples of how to get involved with those concerned who we usually don't take very seriously. And this is exactly the question of this outreach processes. And the example is a series of theater projects in the country, in the state of Tyrolia in Austria, to work with the legal framework for disabled persons. A great idea and great project. I think there are many inspiring. But we have arrived at the question of legal culture. I think that's really what you have described, Hilary, is a question of culture. Perhaps also a question of the self-concept of politicians. So, Antonio, is this something which is scientifically understood?
Well, first of all, your point is very interesting, and also the one raised by Hilary on involving people that normally you will not somehow involve. This is one of the main lessons that we have received from COVID, because one of the point that is clearly emerged is the huge amount of disinformation that we had about COVID. Now, the point is how to put together contrast to disinformation and inclusiveness, contrast to disinformation and legitimacy. And so what I think is that when you are more clear on the options, that means also that you are able to legitimate your action and to reduce the amount of distrust that may generate disinformation. And this is the first point. The second point is that somehow algorithms may help regulators. So these new ideas of RegTech may help us, especially when we have to monitor many complex issues. Of course, we need to know what is the degree of autonomy of the algorithms, because they should be designed in such a way that is clear what are the objectives and the outcomes we are targeting.
Thanks a lot. Claudio, brief question to you, quick, brief answer, please. We just have 1 minute, and I will take another minute for me. I understand you're familiar with the legal cultures in Europe. Do we have similar cultures everywhere in Europe? And is this a culture which appreciates exactly this type of abstract recommendations we have heard here?
I think at this table we have economics, industry, social sciences, political science, but not law. And we also have to situate everything we say inside legal cultures and systems of law that are very different. So if something goes wrong with the sandbox, where does it go then in terms of accountability to law? A court in Dublin is not like a court in London. The European Court of Justice has a way of reasoning that is different from the one of the Supreme Court or the DC Court of Appeal in the US. And this is kind of where perhaps some of the things we're saying today and in the report, better regulation, impact assessment, stakeholders consultations, they haven't touched, at least in Europe, the domain of law. And one slogan in Europe is that unless courts start looking hard into impact assessments as a document preparing legislation and considering court, the quality of that will always be somewhat below standards. But I think especially the rigidity of some ways of legal reasoning in some countries in continental Europe, but also elsewhere, may be a problem or something then we have to modernize that kind of legal culture if we want algorithmic regulation, trustworthy artificial intelligence to really take off. Thank you.
Claudio, thanks a lot. And I'm handing over with this to Elsa Pilichowski. It's great to have you here, Elsa. And just reflecting, I think the word I have heard most very often in this conversation was experimentation. And that's listening, collaborating, and experimentation. These seem to be the buzzwords of this conversation. But Elsa, you have the floor.
On experimentation, you mean, or in more general terms?
In more general terms, I think it's you to close now the session.
Okay,
I'm sorry for spoiling your.
No, okay, we're closing. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure that we were closing. So thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to all those participants today. Mesdames et messieurs, donc bonjour, bonsoir. Merci à vous tous de participer aujourd'hui au lancement de cette 3e édition de la politique de la réglementation perspective de l'OCDE. Je tiens à remercier tout particulièrement les délégués du comité de la politique de réglementation de l'OCDE et du réseau des régulateurs économiques qui se sont joints à nous aujourd'hui. Cette publication est un produit conjoint de ces deux communautés, ainsi que le résultat de vos précieuses contributions, bien sûr. So the discussions today have really shone a light on the fact that sound regulatory policy has never been more important. The ability to provide evidenced, well-reasoned laws and also regulations really helps to make better policies for better lives. We've seen it during COVID, and as the Secretary General remarked, better policies begin with better policy making. The 3rd edition of the OECD Regulatory Policy Outlook has really this as its starting point. And I think we should also celebrate that in the past 3 years, countries have made reforms to improve rulemaking, but there's also much room for progress. In his remarks, our Secretary General really invited us to look ahead and also consider the ongoing and emerging challenges for regulatory policy as we approach the 10th anniversary of the 2012 OECD recommendation on regulatory policy and governance. Let me give you a few examples of areas where there is still significant room to improve in how governments go about regulating. First, no surprise, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted that we need to work better together as a global community to tackle global problems. And this includes on the regulatory front, obviously. We cannot longer regulate in isolation. We are an international regulatory community. Yet, despite that, less than 1/5 of OECD members systematically reflect international dimensions in the domestic rulemaking. This is why the RPO, the Regulatory Policy Committee's ongoing efforts to elevate its work on international regulatory cooperation into a recommendation are really critical and timely. This is really one of the most strategic things that the committee can work on in the future. It will help protect common goods and really help build the global governance of tomorrow that we're all looking forward to. Second example, for governments, learning from past successes and mistakes is of the essence, particularly in the context of post-pandemic recovery. Yet less than 1/4 of OECD members really systematically assess whether regulations actually achieve their objectives. Third, governments can better harness regulatory policy to make rules soundly, yet still with haste. During the pandemic in particular, the time for policymaking was significantly reduced. Some governments initialized emergency provisions that provided a light touch approach to utilize readily available information. Yet again, and worryingly, nearly 2/5 of OECD member countries and the European Union can simply bypass policymaking processes in response to an emergency. So still no work to be done on the resilience of our systems in front of a crisis. And fourth, we need to build more effective avenues for citizen participation in policymaking, including the design of regulations. And I want to add here, including in international regulatory cooperation, where this is also much needed. In this, governments can still do much better at engaging with stakeholders. Less than 1/4 of OECD members systematically inform the public about potential forthcoming rules. Last point, my fifth point, governments can save time and resources by better understanding and balancing risks. Only 1/4 of OECD members has an overall risk and regulation strategy and systematically considers risk when developing rules. So global crises, such as the ones that we've just seen, and complex policy problems are really forcing governments to consider how to regulate better, both now and into the future. Combating climate change, ensuring equality of opportunity, and overcoming issues with the platform economy will all require global efforts. And regulatory policy must be at the center of these discussions for policy action to be successful. The OECD is really committed to continue supporting countries to ensure that their governments are upgraded and really, fit for the future. And this really includes how they regulate. This outlook and the new recommendation of the Council on Agile Regulatory Governance to Harness Innovation that was adopted by OECD ministers last week at our Ministerial Council meeting are really key building blocks for this path forward. I would really like to take this opportunity to thank all the staff in the Regulatory Policy Division who, under the guidance and leadership of Nick Malishev, have done a great job, really a great job carrying forward the OECD's work on regulatory policy in this excellent 2021 edition of the Outlook. I want to thank also our chair, Stefan, for the great leadership in all this work. And I invite really all RPC delegates consider hosting large events in your own countries to really help ensure that the evidence in this Outlook has really a positive impact beyond today. With that, I would really like to thank you all for your attendance today, and thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, I think we can close the meeting. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for the great conversation from all the panelists. And just to reiterate the point that Elsa just made, we'd love to come to your capitals and present both the overall findings of the Outlook, but also the country-specific fact sheets where we really bore down and look at the good regulatory practices that you're implementing at home. So with that, why don't we sign off, and thank you very much for attending.
Goodbye. Thank you.